Okay, thank you, Xander. So just to introduce myself, my name is Marcos Robles. I work in the Arizona chapter of the Nature Conservancy as a conservation scientist. And I've been working on a collaborative that I'm going to talk about in the presentation called the Southwest Climate Change Initiative that is very similar to, we have a very similar sort of mission and goal statement as does your consortium, so I'll get into that. So first of all, just thanks to the consortium folks for allowing us to present some information about what we've been thinking about in terms of climate change. This is the main question that this talk is going to be about. It's a question we've been thinking about for a couple of years. Generally, what does climate change mean for conservation and natural resource management? The topic of today's is a little bit more focused on fire management. So I spoke with some of the folks that joined early on the call, and they said they could hear me okay. If anyone's having a problem hearing me, just let Xander or I know, but I'll go ahead and get started. So the effects of climate change on our natural and water resources in the Southwest have been widely reported in the news and the scientific literature. And so while this might increase our sense of urgency and perhaps even anxiety about climate change and how to respond to it, these reports don't answer a couple of fundamental questions. How does this affect my resources? And what can we do about it collectively? So a few years ago, the Nature Conservancy started a collaborative initiative called the Southwest Climate Change Initiative, or SWCCI for short, to really begin exploring these questions. So SWCCI is really a group like yours. It's a collection of scientists and managers throughout the Southwest, throughout the four corner states in the Southwest, that are working together to translate science to solve a problem. And in this case, what we're trying to do is understand what is known about the impacts of climate change on our natural resources and what tools do we have to respond to it. We place a specific focus on action and actually moving towards action rather than simply just assessing, as I'll talk about in a second. It's composed of folks from NGOs like the Nature Conservancy and the Wildlife Conservation Society, universities including the Climate Assessment for the Southwest at the University of Arizona and the University of Washington, and practitioners who have attended some workshops that we've held about that come from about 40 state, federal, and private agencies. So today I'm going to talk about two products that we have completed as part of this initiative that we think may be helpful to fire managers: a regional climate change assessment and some thoughts coming from collaborative workshops that we have held where managers and scientists are working together on strategies to respond to climate change in these four landscapes that are shown on this map. And I'll get into much more detail into that. The objectives of our initiative are to provide information and tools for how to manage landscapes for resilience when the goalposts are changing under a changing climate. Secondly, we wanted to assess impacts and take action regionally and locally. Again, we placed a specific focus on actually translating some of this information into on-the-ground action, on-the-ground planning, that sort of thing. And we wanted to document and share knowledge through a learning network, because this is a big problem, and it's going to we recognize that it's going to take a lot of folks at the table to try to understand what to do about it. So just an outline of what the points that I'm going to cover. First, I'm going to talk, just give a brief summary of the science that we have gathered from other investigators and our own analyses regarding the effects of climate change on southwestern forests and woodlands. Secondly, I'm going to give a description of a process or a framework that we have developed. It's very similar to what other folks have developed as well. It's a framework for thinking about ways that we can adapt our toolkit and our management plans to respond to climate change. And finally, probably the heart of what might be most interesting to you all is just a preliminary list of fire management strategies that we have developed for two sites in Arizona and New Mexico that are aimed at adapting or adapting to climate change. So when we began our project a few years ago, no study had yet looked at the distribution of temperature change across the units on which managers focus: habitats, watersheds, and species. So the foundation of our regional analysis is a look at how temperatures have changed from 1951 to 2006 based on the best available and most comprehensive climate change data. I want to note that we started with a retrospective look at temperature because we wanted to know how the climate has already changed and how this is impacting ecosystems. So what this map shows is temperature change in the last 55 years. Places that have experienced cooling over this period or decreases in mean annual temperature are shown in green. And those places experiencing warming are shown in yellow, orange, and red, with red indicating the greatest warming. So these results reflect that our region has experienced an increase in mean annual temperatures from between 1 and 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can note there that this has varied a little bit across the region. So as we began to look at the ecological effects of warming, one overriding pattern emerged, and that is that warming is amplifying natural disturbances by altering water availability. So to show this, this is sort of a cartoon of water availability, which is a function of how much water comes into a system from precipitation, that's the blue squiggly line, and how much leaves from evapotranspiration. So temperature is a primary driver of evapotranspiration, and temperature is what we're showing here. So the way to think about this is warmer temperatures will drive more evaporation. So during the months and years when the amount of water available from precipitation is less than what is evaporated away, drought conditions set in, usually followed by an increase in disturbances, both fire and tree mortality. And I've shown this type of disturbance in sort of this yellow area here. So as Tom Swetnam and others have described, these disturbances are often synchronized to climate cycles. They track interannual cycles driven by the El Nino-La Nina Southern Oscillation, and they also track longer decadal patterns driven by changes in sea surface temperatures in the Pacific and the Atlantic. So what happens when we add a degree or two into this equation? What happens when we increase temperatures? Well, water becomes more scarce because higher temperatures drive higher evaporation, which in turn can lead to more extreme and frequent disturbance events. We're calling these sort of amplified disturbances. The amplification is that the area of this red area is larger than perhaps droughts that we've experienced or fire events that we've experienced in the past. So one of the most important features about this graphic is the linear rise in temperatures associated with climate change. Because as temperatures continue to increase, and most models are in agreement that temperatures will continue to increase in our future, it becomes increasingly more difficult that plants, animals, and ecosystems will have the capacity to recover from these disturbances. When we looked at the literature, we found a lot of support for this, or we actually, a recent analysis from Tony Westerling from UC Merced and colleagues has shown that wildfire activity in the western U.S. has increased starting in the middle of 1980s. So in this graph, we have years on the y-axis and frequency of wildfires on, years on the x-axis and frequency of wildfires on the y-axis. So what you can see in this gray box is that starting about 1985, fire frequencies across the rest increased. The authors in their paper show that this pattern is associated with rising spring temperatures, which in turn have led to earlier snow melt and drier conditions earlier in the year. So from a fire management perspective, these changes are expressed as earlier fire starts, longer fire seasons, and more frequent and larger wildfires. Of course, these have been and are going to continue to be harder to control and suppress. In a similar fashion, David Brashears from the University of Arizona and colleagues published a paper that associated a landscape scale mortality event of pinon pine trees with warm temperatures and a drought that hit our region in the early 2000s. The size of this event was really massive, perhaps affecting over 3 million acres of woodlands in the Southwest across all the Four Corner states, which is an area that is about 2.5 times the size of Grand Canyon National Park. Brashears and others have argued that warmer temperatures may have tipped this system toward a much larger disturbance. The thing that actually killed these trees was an insect outbreak, but the proximate cause, they argue, was warmer temperatures during this drought. Now, we have evidence of a similar event, a similar drought mortality event that happened during the 1950s. But that drought happened under slightly cooler temperatures, and there was less mortality across far fewer acres. So all of this gives us some reason to believe that warming is exacerbating what drought already does. Again, an amplified or punctuated response. So in a recent paper, A. Park Williams from, I believe, UC Santa Barbara and colleagues have put together a map that shows the extent of recent fire and drought mortality across Arizona and New Mexico. In this map, the dark green areas are conifer and mixed forests, and the light green areas are pinyon juniper woodlands. Areas with high tree mortality are shown in orange, and areas with large fires are shown in red. I believe this big red splotch might be the Robles fire. In this paper, the authors provided a conservative estimate that 18% of the forests in the Southwest have been impacted in recent decades by drought and wildfire. So about 1/5 of our forests have been impacted in the last decades. These authors also found that since the early 1980s, the frequency of moderate and severe fires has increased in this region. In our own analysis, given these studies that show that warming is a significant driver of ecological response, we wanted to know how warming has varied by major habitats in the Southwest. So this graph shows our results. On the x-axis, we have major habitats across the Four Corner states, and on the y-axis, we have temperature change that these habitats have experienced, again, in the last 55 years. The blue horizontal line represents no change over this time period, so no warming or no cooling. So what you can see right off the bat is that most habitats have warmed in the last 55 years. In fact, we found that 80% of the habitats in the Southwest have warmed significantly in the Southwest, but also note that this warming has varied slightly from habitat to habitat. So if, for example, if we look at the montane forest in the green box here and the pinyon juniper woodlands in this box, their warming falls into the mid-range, or about 1.5 degrees warming in the last 55 years. So there are some habitats that have warmed more and some habitats that have warmed less. Also note the vertical lines here in this graph. This represents the variability of warming across a habitat. So in montane forests, for example, there are some locations within these forests that have experienced very little warming, while others have warmed, near 3 degrees Fahrenheit. So next, what we tried to do in our regional analysis is we wanted an approximate estimate of the vulnerability of these habitats. By vulnerability, what I mean is a description or analysis of how susceptible these systems are to the effects of climate change. The way we did this is by comparing the degree of warming that habitats have experienced compared to the number of species of concern found within these habitats. So we placed habitats into these four vulnerability classes based on these two variables. The greater the temperature change and the larger the number of species of concern, the more vulnerable we assumed the habitat to be. This analysis is certainly a coarse analysis and a first approximation that is focusing on species of concern, but we think it might be useful for at least thinking about this problem at a regional scale and perhaps setting region-wide priorities on what places to look at more closely. So using this method, the most vulnerable habitats that we found, again, those habitats with the highest temperature change in the last 55 years and the most species of conservation concern, are these: subalpine forests, pinyon juniper woodlands, sage shrublands, and Colorado Plateau canyonlands and grasslands. In the habitats where fire management is most relevant, pinyon juniper woodlands were categorized in the second highest class as vulnerable, and montane forests were classified as somewhat vulnerable. We did a similar analysis to evaluate watershed vulnerability. So for watersheds, we focused on species of concern that are aquatic and wetland, or really those species that are dependent upon water. And what we found is that about 70% of the large watersheds, these are 6-digit HUCs, for those of you familiar with HUCs, 70% of these large watersheds have been exposed to a significant rise in mean annual temperatures. The most vulnerable watersheds on this map are shown in dark red. And note that the so-called rim forests here in the Verde and Salt watersheds are in these in the most vulnerable category. So we think that this not only matters for conservation of aquatic species, as this vulnerability assessment pointed out, but also for really water security and water provision to human communities. So these are some pictures of the Schultz Fire, which burned 15,000 acres in a little over a week near Flagstaff, Arizona last year. And so while it was a relatively small fire, it occurred very close to Flagstaff, and subsequent flooding and erosion events directly impacted city's infrastructure and severely damaged a water pipeline that previously supplied 20% of the city's water supply. Direct recovery estimates are estimated to be around $18 million, including suppression and post-fire treatments and flood mitigation. Other expenses, including costs to fix the water pipeline and for long-term rehab, are between $6 and $12 million. In contrast, a fire management plan to treat this area with thinning and burning would have cost about $2 million. So let's just think about those numbers. Pre-fire treatment costs of $2 million versus post-fire treatment costs of between $8 and $24 million, not including insurance claims and payouts. That's a ratio of 10 to 1 post-fire recovery costs versus pre-fire treatment costs. So in this particular case, it's too late to know how much pre-fire treatments would have minimized the damage from this fire. But I think we do have scientific tools, data, and models to help us understand the benefits and the trade-offs of landscape scale treatments to help reduce the risks and the costs associated with this type of fire. At the very least, we can use this example to make the case that large-scale restoration is affordable and cost-effective when compared to the alternative. So I've given you a lot of information on climate change effects on fires, forests, and woodlands. I now want to present some information regarding discussions we have been having as managers on what we can do about it. So in the past couple of years, we have held climate change adaptation workshops in 4 landscape sites in the Southwest and are in the process of turning these sites into demonstration sites, which is simply places where folks are actively integrating climate change adaptation into their planning work and into their management. These are the Bear River in northern Utah, the Gunnison Basin in central Colorado, the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico, and the 4 Forest Restoration Initiative area in Arizona. The 4 Forest Restoration Initiative, or the 4FRI, for those of you not familiar, is an ongoing collaborative effort to accelerate restoration across 4 forests in Arizona: the Apache Sitgreaves, the Coconino, Kaibab, and the Tonto National Forests. These forests are within those 2 watersheds that I showed earlier that are in the highest vulnerability category. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the 4FRI and HAMAS workshops in New Mexico and Arizona, because in those workshops we place a specific focus on fire management of Ponderosa pine forests. Before I get into more detail about the workshops, I just wanted to pause and clarify that we did not miraculously come up with all the answers about how to respond to climate change in a 2-day workshop. But what we did do, and what I hope to illustrate, is that we began a group process that generated some ideas and a discussion for how to respond. And that actually is a lot of progress from, we witnessed a lot of progress from before we held the workshop to after. And we made this progress by asking ourselves these questions. These questions almost forced us to think about how effective, or in some cases ineffective, our current management plans and actions are going to be in a system that is changing. They forced us to think about whether we are monitoring the right things, whether we are prepared to respond to a climate change event that perhaps has already occurred and is predicted to occur. And one of the reasons that we wanted to talk with the Southwest Fire Consortium is that we know that you all have a lot of bench strength of folks like Pete Fillet and Don Falk and others probably, who have given a lot of, many of them, some of them who attended our workshops, and who also have given a lot of thought about how to manage forests when the goalposts are changing under changing climate conditions, how to manage for resilience, for example. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion part of this webinar where we can have a discussion or ask you all, what are your ideas? How would you think about changing your work plans to incorporate what you know about climate change? And how can we continue to share knowledge with one another through webinars like this and other forums? So I just wanted to quickly describe really the simple process or framework that we use to get at what the impacts of climate change are on our resources and what we could do about it. So first, we selected a target, a conservation or management target that was common to us all. This could be a species, an ecological community, or an ecosystem. And we then defined a management objective for that target. Typically, these objectives were lifted from some ongoing and existing work. Second, we assessed the many ways in which climate change has and could impact our target and our ability to meet our objective. So for forest and woodland systems, we reviewed the types of amplified disturbances that I just discussed in the first part. And we also looked at climate change scenarios to understand what these disturbances might look like in the future. Step 3 was to develop a list of management options and turn this list into strategies that the group could carry on based on how effectively they might minimize the impact and how feasible it would be to implement them. And step 4 is actually the implementation step, or at least planning for implementation. In our workshops, we typically completed step 3 and just penciled out what step 4 might look like. But since the time we've held our workshops, in every case, we've had follow-up meetings and discussions, and so we're getting a little bit closer towards implementation. One thing to note about this, the way this framework is shown here, is that this is meant to be a dynamic and iterative process that can be repeated, a process, where we can learn and test questions together. It should look familiar. It's much like the adaptive management cycle, but not exactly the same because it's focused a little bit more on climate change impacts. And the idea is that once strategies are implemented, they really should be reviewed and revised based on monitoring results. Now, we've all seen this cycle before and know how important it is, but I just want to emphasize that given the uncertainty associated with climate change, setting up really good monitoring protocols is probably going to be essential, because it's going to involve a lot of experimentation. So I'm just going to walk through one example of how we use this process to understand impacts and management options. I really simplified this example because we just have time to give you a flavor of what the process looks like. If you really get jazzed about this, or you have more detailed questions about this example, at the end of the talk I will point you to some technical reports that you can download on our website to get more detail about this information. So in the Forest region in Arizona and the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico, we selected Ponderosa pine forests and the ecological process of fire as targets that we wanted to explore. We evaluated both traditional objectives, such as restoring forest species composition and structure, as well as more exploratory objectives to increase the resilience of these forests to climate change. We discussed many of the impacts that I've just summarized, including amplified fire, tree mortality, and again, we used climate change scenarios to understand how these disturbances might look like in the future. Beyond just forest impacts, we also discussed impacts on watershed health and even human communities, both direct impacts to human communities and how they might respond once these large-scale disturbances, once they start to notice these large-scale disturbances. We then spent, I would say, the majority of our time in our breakout groups at our workshops, evaluating our management options and turning these into strategies that would, again, both be effective and feasible. So, for example, in order to respond to an amplified disturbance regime, a common strategy was to ramp up our plans to thin and burn forest at a larger scale, at the landscape scale. And finally, as I mentioned, we did not really have enough time to fully explore step 4, how to implement these strategies. But just to give you one example of follow-up, we've used discussions in the Arizona workshop to begin to explore how to incorporate climate change considerations into a landscape scale restoration NEPA document. And so in this process, we and others are encouraging the Forest Service to use climate change scenarios in their effects analysis. And we have Ed Smith on the line if folks are interested in learning more about that, and we can get to that in the question section. One thing that we have learned in this process is that there's perhaps a fortuitous connection between the work you all do and climate change. So as I've just shown, one of the fundamental ways in which climate change is affecting our natural resources is through the amplification of the disturbance regime, specifically fire and drought mortality. So it just so happens that our suite of fire management tools are designed to manage, maintain, and restore these very same disturbances or disturbance regimes. So I would argue in the short term, which from a climate change perspective is the next couple of decades, we have to continue to learn how to use these tools and adapt these tools to meet objectives in a changing climate. Okay, now I'm going to spend some time talking about some of the strategies we came up with during the workshops. So in our workshops, we spent a lot of time discussing how fire management and thinning could be retooled to meet the challenge of a changing climate. The general theme of these discussions is captured in this first item, that the scale of the management is going to need to be increased in order to match the scale of the disturbances. So a lot of discussion centered around treating more acres with prescribed fires and thinning in order to reduce their susceptibility to uncharacteristic fire. We explored a few specific ways to do this. One idea was to integrate climate change data and projections, such as El Nino or La Nina, either past events or projections of future events, to track when we might expect earlier springs and to see if we could do that, if we could plan earlier prescribed burn dates. We also discussed allowing for more wildland fire where feasible. We explored ways in which we could configure treatments in such a way that we could create a landscape mosaic. So different aspects of this that we discussed would be a mosaic that could be used to break up landscape fuel continuity, for example. Mosaic could also be used to preserve wildlife habitat and connectivity, which was a topic of discussion at the Arizona workshop in relation to the Mexican spotted owl. Preserve this wildlife habitat and connectivity within a system, a larger system that was managed for fire. Our discussion also bridged toward strategies that would maintain ecological processes or functions in the face of climate change. Of course, the desired effect of fire management is to influence the fire regime, which is a primary ecological process of these forests, and these effects should not be minimized. But we also discussed other ways that fire management could be used to sustain ecological function. So, for example, what are the best ways to treat forests in ways that minimize susceptibility to widespread erosion? And after fires, could we be prepared to reseed with drought-tolerant species or other measures to help minimize post-fire erosion events? I'm sort of posing these as questions because, again, in our workshops, we didn't necessarily have all the answers, but perhaps we were asking ourselves different questions. In a similar fashion, managers could experiment with burning and thinning treatments that increase snow retention and water infiltration. So at least one peer-reviewed study suggests that moderate thinning can improve snowpack retention when compared to no thinning or more heavy thinning. So our last set of no-regret strategies had to do with our own society. Our society's acceptance of climate change effects on our forests and fire, and also what we should do about it. We recognize that this is going to require a major effort from all organizations. So we discussed the possibility of media campaigns and or educational outreach, or other efforts that would improve understanding of fire management. Why we need to do more, how the short-term costs of increased incidence of smoke or perhaps even less public access to treated areas are outweighed by the long-term benefits of improved forest health and water security. And we recognize that more treatments are going to require more funding from both traditional sources as well as new sources, such as a more robust small-diameter wood industry, and perhaps even a payment for services, whereby communities pay for forest treatments in return for security of their water provision. So this is something, payment for services, that has been done all over the world, but it's actually something that's already been done in the Southwest. Based on some great work from some local organizations and the Nature Conservancy, the citizens of Santa Fe agreed to pay a surcharge on their water bill in order to pay for forest restoration in the watershed uphill that is a major supply of water to their city. So in conclusion, climate change is already impacting southwestern forests and woodlands. Several studies suggest that the primary way that it is doing this is by amplifying forest disturbances, both fire and tree mortality, and that this can then subsequently lead to degradation of soil and water ecological processes. Second, any climate change response, we think, must involve an amplified use of fire management tools, because these are the best tools we have on hand to manage these disturbances. This really means that your work is really even more essential under a changing climate. And it also means that we need to sort of double down in persuading society that fire management is a necessary and cost-effective way to maintain our forest health, ensure our water provision under a changing climate. And finally, we think that we're starting to have the building blocks, that we do have the building blocks to address climate change. When we looked at our management objectives in light of climate change at our workshops, it forced us to ask questions and move down the road of thinking about perhaps different objectives. And so I'm calling this moving down the road to resilience, which is something that we all talk a lot about, but at least in my opinion, haven't yet defined exactly what that means. And so here's just some ideas that we have about what it might look like. Key aspects of this is that it's going to require working at the landscape scale. So projects that are not just across tens or hundreds of acres, but across tens to hundreds of thousands of acres. It's also going to have to involve experimentation to see if we can use these tools in a way that promotes landscape diversity, such as preserving wildlife refugia, for example. Given climate change impacts, we may need to reorient our management objectives to maintaining ecological processes, such as increasing water infiltration and reducing soil erosion. And finally, an accelerated response is going to require some fundamental changes within our society as a whole. Within our own management community, we are going to have to continue to collaborate, share knowledge, and work together so that we can achieve fire management at a larger scale. And the fact that our two initiatives or consortium are working together already is a good sign, but of course we need to continue doing so. And then within the larger communities that we live in, we're going to have to figure out how to create a social license, both to increase acceptance of fire management tools and also to pay for it. I just wanted to close with a few things that we heard people say at the end of the workshops, and you can read these on your own. What I wanted to share is hearing folks say these things reinforced my own feelings after attending these workshops, which was that I felt more energized and motivated to start thinking about this problem after the workshop. Maybe there's something probably about human nature that makes it easier to solve really big and complex problems when you do it in a community rather than as an individual. And given the nature of your consortium, I could see a similar process being helpful within your community to begin thinking about these issues. So we've begun a process at SWCCI, and maybe it's something that you can join us in going down that road to resilience. We have lots of materials, reports, etc. on our websites for you to learn more, have more detailed questions. I think Xander mentioned that these website links, you can copy them down now, but will also be displayed on the Forest Guild website. And I'll just turn it over to Xander. I really look forward to this discussion, and thanks for taking the time.
Well, thank you so much, Marcos. That was a great presentation. And now what I'm going to do, just as a warning to everyone, I'm going to take all the participants off mute. So if you've got your radio blaring in the background, you turn it off. And we'll open it up for questions. You can also type questions in the chat box. So if anybody wants to speak up, I know it's a little hard when we're all on the phone, but just go ahead and jump in with a question for Marcos. And maybe I'll ask a question to sort of get things rolling. One of my wonders as you were presenting, Marcos, was how obviously all these models that predict changing climate, they're not exact, they're models. And I wondered how important the uncertainty in those models was throughout the process. For example, precipitation, you didn't talk, changing precipitation regimes, you didn't address as much. You really focused on the temperature, which is probably easier to predict. Was that an issue in the workshops, or is that something that's a focus for later on?
Yeah, that's a great question. In all our workshops, we worked with climate change scientists from various places, including NCAR in Colorado, and they helped develop some climate change scenarios for us that gave projections of temperature. We also did look at precipitation, and at least in one case, we looked at hydrology projections. And we talked a lot about uncertainty as well. And so there is far less uncertainty regarding what's going to happen with temperatures. Most models agree that temperatures are going to increase, and the disagreement is the degree of how fast they're going to change or increase. With precipitation, there's not yet agreement with the models themselves. Generally, the preponderance of them are projecting drier winter seasons, and the monsoon is just a coin flip at this point. They really can't say what's going to happen with the monsoon. So what we did in our workshops is or in our breakout groups where we focused on targets, is we really kind of bracketed, what might happen with temperature and precipitation into different scenarios. So we thought, what might be the case if there's warmer temperatures and less precipitation overall, as one case, and what might happen where there's higher precipitations, maybe less winter rainfall, but higher summer precipitation. And so that's really the best we can do with the uncertainty we're given. I think the outcome of that discussion really depends on the target that you were talking about. If it was a species that's really dependent on summer rainfall, then that second scenario I talked about was probably a really important one to discuss.
Great, thanks. Are there other questions?
I had a question. This is Pete Foulet. That was a really nice presentation, Marcos. Thank you. I had a question about the vulnerability analyses, where when you showed the four corner states, the most vulnerable ecosystems were not the forests. The forests and woodlands were kind of in the second or even third categories. And I wonder, at least from a fire point of view, there would seem to be a fairly high vulnerability to a lot of these higher elevation systems, in that they're the ones that have the large amount of biomass and thus the potential for the most intense fires and the most severe fire effects, and some really long-term implications for watersheds because these are at the top of the watershed. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Sure, that's a really good question. The whole business of doing a vulnerability assessment for climate change is something that is a developing science, and when we looked at this, we were able to, as I said, kind of give a first approximation. But one of the aspects of vulnerability that we weren't able to fully capture habitat by habitat was habitat's sensitivity.
All right, doing good, sir. Are you hard at it? How you been doing? Good. Well, good.
Hope you can still hear me. The idea is that habitats are not going to have the same sensitivity to 1.5 Fahrenheit rise. Some will be more sensitive and respond more quickly than others. And at the time that we did the vulnerability assessment, we just didn't feel like we had sort of scientifically valid information where we could evaluate sensitivity across habitats. But it's probably certainly the case that all habitats and all species are not going to have the same response to the same degree of temperature rise, for example.
Yeah, I wonder if vulnerability to fire or, say, biomass available for burning or something like that could actually perhaps become a separate kind of variable to be considered.
Yeah, given the case that we were trying to make, that just sort of these amplified disturbances are going to be more of what we see in the future, I think doing a vulnerability assessment from that perspective, a process perspective on both fire, triggers for fire, thresholds for fire, and also drought mortality across the region would be a really interesting way to do this. You know, the way I see vulnerability assessments, they're going to get better, and the more specific the question is that you want to address with the assessment, perhaps the better the outcome.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Marcos, this is Stephanie Smith from City of Flagstaff, and I was curious, through your vulnerability workshops in the 4 networks that you worked with, what type of engagement or participation was there with local governments? I know 4FI has a local presence, but I was curious about the other 3.
Yeah, I was only able to attend the Arizona workshop, so I'm not certain about the other 3. I think we do have Ann Bradley on the phone, who was at helped run the New Mexico workshop, so maybe she could comment on that.
Hey, Marcos, this is Patrick, and
Oh, Patrick.
I'm not sure about the Jemez. Maybe Ann can address that if she is here. But in Utah, we had county representatives. It was almost an entirely rural area we were looking at. And in Gunnison, we had folks from Gunnison County who were pretty well represented. So we've had at least county input, not so much municipal.
Thanks, Patrick. And so Patrick is with our New Mexico chapter, and he's kind of the lead of our SWCCI initiative. So thanks for that. Are there other questions about perhaps any questions about either the Arizona or New Mexico workshops and some of the fire strategies we discussed?
I had a question. Are there kind of plans to do these kind of vulnerability, these assessments at like kind of more smaller scale, kind of at the to be able to compare like the Sky Islands versus the Colorado Plateau or something like that?
You mean at a larger scale to compare across?
Well, I mean, for example, like if somebody from the Coronado is looking at this, it kind of might be a little fuzzy in terms of what they see. This is kind of a regional Southwest type of look at things. But I was wondering, some of those people might want to do kind of a similar thing for one forest, or for one, for kind of their local area.
Right. So what I should clarify is that we did try to really work at different scales. So we did this regional assessment across the four corner states on the one hand, but then our workshops were really focused on these local landscapes. So the Jemez Mountains, for example, or the Gunnison Basin, which is one watershed within Colorado, or the Bear River in Utah. So the major point is that this can be applied at local scales, and in fact, what we learned through our initiative is that it's really important to look at both scales, to look at what the regional trends are and how your system might compare to others, but also really to go down to a scale where people are actually working, and we think this method works for that.
And let me just add, if I may, this is Patrick again, actually just jumping off on the last two questions. Looking out at the future, we see that we're encouraged by the kind of results that we've gotten and the comments we've received at these four workshops. So now we're looking for opportunities, to apply the method to other landscapes, and we're not the only organization to do so. There are others who, like Wildlife Conservation Society, which has been a great partner in this effort, to adapt and apply the same vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning approach to different places. It's pretty straightforward, and it requires only the development of a good, solid science and management partnership. And a second point I wanted to make harkens back to the question about engagement of local governments. And I am myself really interested in seeing climate adaptation planning become kind of a more comprehensive approach that brings in more people, including skeptics and people from different sectors of the community: agriculture, ranching, water users, municipalities, all of the people who depend on the services that these landscapes provide, in order to build a stronger plan, for one thing, but also develop the very kind of social license that Marcos was talking about, and the political and financial support for the kind of expanded and modified conservation activity that needs to happen in the face of really rapid climate change. So that's kind of what we're working toward right now.
Patrick, if I could, what's sort of required in terms of funding or commitment if somebody on this call or if somebody within the Southwest Fire Consortium was interested in kind of initiating this process? what would you tell them about what to line up in terms of resources to make it happen?
Okay, yeah, good question. And you know, what's sort of the minimum threshold? That's what we think about for building a credible process that's going to really deliver a good adaptation strategy that's going to build momentum and result in some on-the-ground action. And of course, it depends on the size of the landscape and the complexity and the number of landowners and so on. But you know, I think it can be done with the following elements. First, you've got to have at least a couple of people who have run similar workshops before. That'll save you a lot of time if you can bring somebody in from whatever organization to help design it. And that's going to, you know, it may or may not cost something depending on who you get. You also need, you know, space and funding for a couple or 3 days you know, to host a workshop at a local college, university, community center, what have you. You know, that can cost a few $1,000. And then I want to say that really the biggest investment you need to make is in developing the climate projections and getting those interpreted by local and regional ecological experts. Okay, and that takes some legwork in advance that's pretty substantial. You know, I'm talking about a few months worth of on and off work by climatologists like the folks we managed to draw in, very talented, knowledgeable people from the National Center for Atmospheric Research or the Western Water Assessment or the Climate Assessment for the Southwest. That's an absolutely essential piece of the puzzle, as well as, you know, the local managers and the local experts whose commitment you need to a series of short sessions, conference calls, or short workshops in person, you know, culminating in this 2 or 3 day session, and then following that up with some documentation of the workshop, and then figuring out next steps. So, you know, I think you're talking about you know, just ballpark figure, let's say $40,000, $50,000, including staff time. I might lower that a little bit to say 25.
Well, is there maybe one last question, and then we'll wrap up? Okay, maybe people are eager to get to lunch, but I want to thank Marcos again. It very informative, and certainly for me, it's sort of got the juices flowing, got some thought processes rolling, so I really appreciate that. And again, we'll send out an email once the recording is available. So I want to thank everybody who joined in today, and we'll look forward to doing some other future webinars. Again, we'll have one on mixed conifer May 18th, and then Pepe will cover landscape fire history and age structure patterns in June. So you have those to look forward to. So with that, I'm going to close down the webinar, and it'll sort of automatically dismiss you, I believe, on your side, and I'm going to close the phone line. So I thank you all very much for participating, particularly you, Marcos, for an excellent presentation. Thanks so much.
Oh,
Thank you.
thanks for the opportunity.
I feel like that maybe you could pull it off for 10. Yeah. Depends on how much people are volunteering their time.